Hi there, Neil from Diagonal Move here, taking a look today at a game called The Lamps Are Going Out, World War One. It is a strategic scale game where you play through the entirety of the First World War. This video is going to be the first in probably a series of videos where I play through the game with the intention of highlighting how the game works and how all the different rules fit together. It's a very interesting game. It's quite a simple game in many ways, but the build-up of different elements by the end of the game, it means it's quite a different game from when you first start in terms of its complexity. I've played this game, I think this is fifth time I've played it now, this playthrough. The first two times I played it two-player, and the second two times I've played it solo. It's not really designed for solo, but you can do it. There's no real hidden information or anything. There is 4 different factions to manage within the two sides, but that's not too bad when you compare it to some of the other games I've had on the channel, such as Cataclysm, for example. I've tried a few times to film an overview of, quotes, the basics of the game, but there are so many if, buts and maybes and a smorgasbord of special rules that made that quite difficult, and the easiest way is for me to just get started and play. So I'm going to do one video per turn, and in the descriptions of the videos I'll highlight where certain rules are coming in for the first time as we play through. Now, a quick note about my previous playthroughs: I have played it 4 times, 3 of them finished before the end of 1916. Only the most recent playthrough, finished the other day, managed to get to 1918, and that ended in spring of 1918. So bear that in mind as we go through. We may not get to the end of the game, and therefore there may be certain things that are not covered in this series of videos in terms of the special rules and so on, but we'll see how we go. Hopefully you'll get enough to understand how the game builds up with this video, and then you'll be able to dip in and out of the other ones should there be something that particularly catches your eye in terms of how the game develops over time. Okay, so the aim of the game is for each side to conquer the other's home nation, or within a certain faction, and you'll do that by conquering territories, perhaps unsurprising. For the Central Powers, which is Germany, Austro-Hungary and Turkey and Bulgaria, memory serves, you are aiming to conquer the region around Paris, which is here, and then hold that until the end of the combat phase for the next time the Triple Entente player goes. The Triple Entente player, which is the player who controls the British Isles, France, Russia at the start of the game, and then eventually Italy, Romania and the United States as well. You are trying to conquer Berlin, which is here, and do the same thing. Hold it until the end of the next German combat phase. Should neither of those things happen before the end of 1918, it's a calculation based on area control, who has the most home nations, territories of their enemies in their control, that kind of thing. And then the German player or the Central Powers player will win if they have a higher number of VP, to beat a certain threshold. I think it's 7 VP more than the Triple Entente player at the end. So if the game does go to the end, it's almost the Triple Entente player's game to lose. But as I've said in my playthroughs so far, that's not happened yet, but we'll see. We do have a couple of features on the map I would like to highlight now before I sort of zoom in a little bit more for the actual playthrough. So the main areas really is this big central piece in the beginning. This in the middle, sorry, this is the main map, and it's all area movement type stuff going on. Here on the left hand side you have the East Africa, which is a kind of a point-to-point movement track. There are special rules that apply to that area, which I'll cover as we move on to it. The Middle East and the area around Turkey, sort of here, that is again a point-to-point track for the most part, with some special rules, and that doesn't come into play until the next turn, which is going to be winter of 1914. We're starting the game in fall or autumn of 1914. Some nations are neutral, so for example Greece and Albania are both neutral. They have certain special rules governing them. particularly Greece. The other countries at the start of the game that are neutral include Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey itself, and the US. Players cannot move into or perform combat with a neutral nation until it joins the war in one capacity or another. And with the exception of with the exception of Turkey, that is all done through the play of certain cards, which are these cards here on the sides. Okay, and there's a few different cards which I'll explain as we go through. Other key areas to highlight are the submarine warfare boxes up here on the left, which demonstrate the rules governing warfare and the use of submarines at the time. That's quite an abstract thing where you roll against a table with results dictated by whether you're operating under the Hague Convention or whether you have unrestricted submarine warfare going on. Similarly, we have the blockade box here, which is a naval blockade in the North Sea. The German and what's known as the Western Allies will fight naval battles there, again quite abstracted, with the aim of disrupting each other's production, predominantly the British production really. Anything else? The other thing to note is the black blobs where Switzerland and the Netherlands they are out of play for the whole game. Anything else? So I suppose the main thing really is, which we'll come into as we go down a little bit more, is there are 4 factions and two players. So the 4 factions will be controlled by the 2 players, with each player controlling 2 factions. Okay, so the Eastern Allies, which is Russia, America, Romania and Serbia, on the Eastern Allies, and the French, Italians and the British are controlled as the Western Allies. So there are 2 different factions for the Triple Entente player. The Central Powers of Germany, which is a separate faction, and then Austria-Hungary, Turkey, Bulgaria will be the Central Allies. So there's 2 turns per round for each player. And the turn sequence is Germany, then the Western Allies, the Eastern Allies stroke the US, and then the Central Allies. So each year, or each turn sequence is a season of a year, and you'll play twice in each year. So each round you'll play twice. I think that's the main thing. There are some things around supply and stuff like that which we'll come into if we need to as we go through. But for the rest of the game, I'm going to zoom in a little bit and focus on certain sections as I play. I will be drawing cards from different piles, probably off screen, but showing you as I move through. And there'll be event cards that dictate something that will or may not happen on the turn for each faction. Okay, there's quite a few things going on in here, but it's actually relatively straightforward once you dive into it. And speaking of diving into it, let's do that now. Okay, it is fall 1914, or autumn 1914, and the Germans faction will go first. And there's a Central Powers player aid with a dedicated sequence of play, and the same for the Triple Entente. They're very similar, but there are some certain differences which I'll come on to as we go through. The first thing we'll do is we'll do what's called rebuild the event deck. And what that means is you take the cards relevant to the faction from the previous year that haven't been spent, and you will build the deck for the current year. Now at the moment you don't have to do that in this particular turn because you've already got the cards in hand for 1914. You will only do the rebuild deck step when you reach spring of each year. So you do it sort of 4 times throughout the game, but you do that for the first time in spring of 1915. So the first thing we realistically need to do in this turn is draw an event card for the Germans. Okay, so this is a typical event card. It will have a title, the faction it's applicable to, a year it's relevant to in terms of when it can first be drawn normally. This one, for example, is 1914 or 15. And then it says place a marker near the British Isles for the East Asia Squadron. And what you'll do during the Western Allies combat phase is the Western Allies player will have an option to expend a fleet and then try a die roll of a 3+ to remove the marker. If that doesn't happen, or they fail to remove the marker, then there'll be a die roll, and on a 5 or a 6, production will be affected for the Western Allies, and this marker is removed at the end of 1915. So this really is the best time to actually have had this card drawn. So that's what we'll do then, is we'll grab the East Asia Squadron marker, place it in the British Isles, and then I will leave this card somewhere down here to remind myself to actually do that when the right phase happens. So the East Asia Squadron goes over by the British Isles. Let's pop that there. So remind myself. That's it for the event card at this stage. And the next up we do the movement, which is in order here. You move armies and artillery, redeploy the Sostropen unit for Germany only. Now we don't have that yet, so that comes out as one of the technological advances as the game progresses. Move fleets. Now the option for moving fleet is to move them to or from the blockade box. And I think what I'll do is I will move both of them to the blockade box, particularly as we want to do some damage to that fleet to stop them being able to prevent the East Asia Squadron disrupting supply or production. Next up, we move the U-boats, and again, the choice for the U-boats is to move from the Hague Convention to the unrestricted warfare box, and I won't bother with that at this point. Okay, so I've kind of jumped slightly out of turn there, but they're the two simplest things done anyway. Now, in terms of movement, you can move 2 counters most of the time, and certainly at the start of the game. You can move 2 units anywhere within land areas that you control. For the Germans at least. Now, Germany currently control all the grey areas. They can move into the Austro-Hungarian Empire areas if they want to, but there are rules around that, particularly affecting the allies of the Germans, which I'll come to when it's the Central Allies' turn a little bit later. But for the most part, you can move 2 units anywhere within land areas you control as the German player. Now, there are special rules because it's the first turn. There are a number of first turn special rules. One of them is called the von Schieffelin plan, and then you may move 1 army. You may only move 1 army from Hanover or the Rhine to Prussia and Posen. But basically, that means is if you want to move anybody from the Western Front to the Eastern Front, you can only move 1. When it comes to, I'll come on to the next bits in a minute. So what we'll do is I won't actually move anybody from the Western to the Eastern Front because there are other rules, and essentially in the first turn what the Germans want to do is they want to try and conquer Belgium, which is just here underneath those counters. So rather than moving people to and from the East or Western fronts, now that may leave this area a little bit exposed, but what I want to do is I want to move some people basically. So I'm going to move 2 units from whatever that is, the Rhine, over to Hanover. Okay, and that's all the movement done for the Germans. Next up, we do combat, and there's a few different types of combat. The 3 types of combat that affect the German side are really only Navy combat, guerrilla combat, which is specific to the Germans, and ground combat. Now, Navy combat is super simple. You basically roll a dice for each fresh fleet in the naval box, and on a 1 or a 2 you do some damage, with the 1 or the 2 reflecting how many damage points you have. So now each fleet, each counter really has 2 sides. There's a fresh side with no markings on it, and then a spent side. Okay, so you only roll for the ones that are fresh, and in this case we're rolling 2 for the Germans and 3 for the Western Allies. Let me just go and grab my dice. Okay, so starting with the Germans, we have 2 misses. That's not so good. And then 3 for the Allies. We have 3 hits. That is pretty shocking from a German player's point of view. So what will happen is you remove this, 2 will be spent, 2 of the fleets will be flipped to spent, and then there's another point of damage to expend on the German fleets, meaning we do have to already remove 1 of those German fleets. So that's going back over here to the unit markers. Now we can rebuild the fleets, but they cost quite a bit when the production phase comes around. Okay, so the Western Allies have 1, meaning the spent German fleet has to retreat back to the high seas, German high seas box. And that's it. Next up is guerrilla combat. This is Germany only, and it's specific only to the East Africa track. The East Africa track is kind of special because you cannot move, which is why I didn't highlight any movement in this track. You can only move units as a result of combat, which we'll come on to if and when we need to. But what's special about combat in this area for the German side, not so much the British side, but the German side, is that they can choose between regular combat and guerrilla combat. Regular combat is as we'll see in a minute with the ground combat in the Western Front, that's the same, but the Germans will have the diagram modifier of +2, and they can only do it when they're fresh. The guerrilla combat, though, you roll a die, and on I think it's a 5 or a 6, you do actually do some damage to the British side. So let's do that. And you've rolled a 2, so there's no damage. What's different about guerrilla combat to ground combat, aside from just rolling one dice, is that the German player isn't spent as a result of doing it, and you do not need to be fresh to carry it out. So that's guerrilla combat done. Roll a dice, hope for a 5 or a 6. So next up then is ground combat, and you can perform ground combat anywhere on the map that your faction or the faction currently playing is adjacent to an enemy, if you've got a fresh unit in the area you're going to be attacking from. For example, this German counter here could attack up into Lithuania, or it could attack down into Brest-Litovsk because it's fresh. This counter cannot attack into Poland because it is spent. So worth remembering, you cannot attack with spent units. Okay, they can defend, but they cannot attack. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically ignore the Eastern Front for now, and we're just going to go to Hanover primarily. We don't want to do much with the Rhine because we want to keep our units for a potential later attack by the French. But we've got 5 counters there and 2 in Belgium. So what I'll do is I'll pop the battle location marker into Belgium, and then we'll remove these 2 counters just to make it a little bit easier to see what happens with this combat. Okay, I'll just move the camera down a little bit. Actually, hopefully we can see what's going on without me needing to do that, but we'll see. If in future videos you would prefer me to zoom in a little bit, then I will do so. But for now, it's fine. So we've got 2 fresh units on the defending side, 5 on the attacking side, okay? We have special rules for the Germans in this turn only coming in their attack. So you can re-roll each attack up to 2 times against Belgium or any area in France. And that's because the Germans want to control Belgium because it gives them extra production this turn. So first thing we'll do then is we'll roll a die for the attacker and modify it by any applicable modifiers. Applicable modifiers would normally be the terrain, so mountains, and any buffs essentially given to you by cards or counters or markers. In this case we don't have any, so it's just a simple straightforward die roll, and we rolled a 3 as the German side, and we've rolled a 3 as the Western Allies. Now in this case we're attacking the Belgian counter. There's a Belgian army and a British army. Attackers win ties most of the time, unless there is technology that allows you to do something different. But in the most part, certainly at this point in the game, attackers win ties. Now, we've won, so the Belgian side is flipped to spent, but importantly, the attacker is always flipped to spent as well when you're attacking an enemy ground unit. And then we move on to the next counter. So we have the German First Army as it is, and the British First Army. So Germany first. And we rolled a 4. Now that's cool. Quick note, because we are attacking from the same location as previously, so from Hanover into Belgium, and we were successful with an attack already, we add in the Germany big push marker. So that means that 4 is pushed to 5. So the Brits basically need a 6 to win this combat. And they've rolled a 4. So same thing happens. We flip the British and we flip the Germans, and we move to the next the next counter down. That big push marker carries across because it was a successful attack. Had the attack failed, that big push marker would have been lost. Had we moved combat from another area, marker would also have been lost, even if we were attacking into the same place from that other area. Okay, but anyway, we carry on. Now, this is important, this bit. We're attacking against 2 spent units. There are no more fresh units, which means this time, if the Germans win, the Belgian and the British have to retreat. Okay, so let's try that. And we've got a 6 plus the 1, that's a 7. It's unassailable. I'll roll it anyway for form's sake. We've got a 2. Okay, so they have to retreat. So what's going to happen here? These 2 counters will retreat back into the Somme. Okay, now this is important here because actually let me just flip this counter over. Okay, so we've flipped over. So we've retreated from Belgium into the Somme. Belgium was the home nation of the Belgian army, and what would happen often when you're defending a home nation is that you would have the option to do what's called they shall not pass, or you shall not pass, something like that, and it means you can remove a counter permanently from the game in the hope of doing a die roll to prevent the advance. Now, because the home nation doesn't have a flag and it does not have production, that doesn't apply, is my understanding, here in Belgium. So we've retreated out from Belgium into the Somme. Now, the German army must advance at least the unit that attacked. They can also bring as many other units as they want, so I'll bring all 5 of them through. So we're now totally conquered Belgium as the German army. We do still have 2 fresh units for the Germans. And even though the Germans were involved in that last attack, they didn't roll dice for those 2 remaining fresh units, which means they can attack again if we want to. So we can, in theory now, attack into the Somme, this time against just a single French unit. The other 2, well, we attack against them all, but the units those 2 have been spent. So now we do the same thing. We attack a 5 from Germany, no big push marker because we're attacking from a new area into a new area. So 5 for Germany, a 4 for the French. So we are now attacking with our final German counter against 3 spent Allied units. So let's do that. And this time, because it's a second successful attack from Belgium into the Somme, we will attack again. And that is going to be 3 plus 1, which is a 4. We could re-roll that, go into the special rule, which would mean... Let's do that. Let's highlight the special rule. The special rule for the von Schieffelin plan is we can re-roll if we don't want to, and I will. And we've rolled a terrible score, so we have the option to re-roll again, and we have a 6. That's cool. That's what we wanted. 6 pushes up to 7. Yeah, even with a 6, we don't succeed in our defence as the French army, and so we have to now retreat. But the French army can, because it's a home area for the French army, it's in a production site, we can do that permanent elimination thing and prevent the German advance, which I'll do for demonstration purposes. So I'll take off the counter permanently and I'll roll a die, and that's a 4. And what I'll do is I will deduct the total number of eliminated units from the die roll, and if it is 2 plus, the modified die roll is 2 plus, the advance fails and the Germans stay put in Belgium. They don't come into the Somme, but that army is eliminated. Now we have a modified result of 3, and the French have already lost a unit, but on the plus side for the French at least, the Germans can no longer advance into the Somme, meaning the attack ends there. Okay, so that is combat for the Germans. Hopefully that all made sense. It's really rolling dice and modifying the result most of the game, but there are a few technical issues around certain things. Okay, so that is combat done. I'm not going to do any combat in the Eastern Front in this turn, which means we now move on to production. So production is quite a long and complex step. Well, not really, but it can be. So we've got, the first thing we do is to check the blockade box. Who is in control of the blockade box, which is this? If it's Germany, that has an impact on production for both Germany and Britain. Essentially, the Germans have a positive production modifier in this phase. If they control it, if the Western Allies control it, there's no effect. Okay, but importantly for the Germans is that positive modifier for their production, and also it's a negative modifier on the British as well. So yeah, important for the Germans to hold that box. They're not holding it at the moment, so there's no effect. We resolve any events. Now, they do have this card which impacts the combat phase and the production phase, but although it's a German card, it's actually the Western Allies that are impacted by that result. So there's no effect here. Next up, we do U-boat attrition. Now this is a table, and we roll 2 dice per fresh fleet in the boxes there. Now we only got 1 fresh fleet, so we'll roll the 2 dice. We've got a 2, and now according to the table, the submarine is spent if the USA has declared war. Now the USA has not declared war at this point. The USA entry into the war is dictated by this track. When it reaches the top, the US are in the game, and that's not for a long time yet. So nothing to worry about there, meaning we can move on to spending and production spending. There is one further step before spending, which is receive, transfer, production, but there's none of that here at the moment. So refit units, raise units, construct trenches, and transfer production. They're the different steps in production spending. Refit units is spending a certain number of production points to flip your units from spent to fresh, or to build new units, depending on what you feel like, which is raising new units, constructing trenches. That's when you spend production points to build a trench. You cannot do that until 1915. There are 2 trenches on the board at the moment. They start the game there, but you cannot build trenches for another couple of turns yet. And then finally, transfer production. So if you have more production than you can spend, you can give some to your allies, and there are certain rules around that as well. But let's not worry about those certain rules for the moment. Let's just do some production. So the Germans start the game with 12. That's I think it's 1 there. 1, 2, 3, 6, 8. I think it's 12 at the start. I'll just double check that. Yeah, it's 12. So we have 12 points to spend. So we'll flip over the units here. So that's 2, 5. There's 1 to flip there. That's 6, 7, 8 for the submarine, 9 for the ship, meaning we have 3 remaining. And what I'll do is I will build, if I can, I'll rebuild that boat actually. Now boats are expensive, so it's going to cost me 2 to rebuild that boat in a spent capacity, which I've done. 1 is remaining, and I will transfer that production. I don't really want to build a unit, I can't build trenches at the moment, so at this point I can transfer production, and the only faction I can give production to at this stage is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I'll place that production point here. And there are certain rules around that. You can only give production to a side with less production than you, I believe it is, and you cannot give more than the total amount of production that they have anyway. So for example, the Austro-Hungarians have 3 production, I couldn't give them 6, for example, and I couldn't give them more than 4 anyway. They're the basic rules, but we'll just start with 1 production transferred to Vienna, and then we move on to the next part, which is Germany specific, and Western Allies as well, but in terms of the Central Powers it's Germany specific, and that is we draw a tech card. And tech cards give you buffs and new weapons to impact the game. And we've got quite a good one to start with, which is aerial reconnaissance. Now this lets us perform dogfights, and it lets us win ties in combat if we're the defender. So I'll pop that to one side, just remind myself it's there. Unfortunately, I probably can't fit all these cards on the screen as we go through, but it's definitely there. The aerial reconnaissance and the air strand of the technology all around allows you to place air superiority markers on the board, which give you a buff in combat, and they can support artillery, things like that. Normally, you would roll, each side would roll a dice based on the number of aerial cards they've got in that tech strand, and the winner would be allowed to place air superiority markers down based on the amount by which they have won the die roll. Now, in this circumstance where one side has got a card and the other side doesn't, it's almost an automatic victory. So I'm just going to allow it to allow the Germans to place that card on the board. I'm not 100% sure if that's right, whether you have to roll off anyway, but because it's an automatic win, Germans can place their air superiority marker in the Rhine, just for the sake of argument and demonstration here. The final step in the regroup phase is to reset artillery, which we don't have on the board at the moment. And so now we move over to the Western Allies' turn. So it's a triple entente player. Okay, so it's the Western Allies' turn, and we follow the similar sequence of play to the German side, but there are a few differences, for example in combat and also in production. Quite minor for the most part, but enough to warrant going slightly slower at certain points as we go through the game. Maybe not so much in this video, but certainly in later ones. Okay, so the first thing you do, as before, is draw that event card. And here we have the Pantalon Rouge, a -1 DRM to the French, with a single mandatory attack by the French this turn. Okay. Now, the important thing to note with this is that there is also a special rule in combat for the Western Allies, in that the French have to make an attack. That is called Plan 17, and one Western army must attack from Verdun into the Rhine with a -1 DRM. Now, my understanding is that the DRM here would also stack with the DRM from that special rule, meaning the attack from Verdun into the Rhine will be at a -2. Okay, mandatory and at a -2. Not good. Okay, cool. So we'll leave that there for now, just to remind myself. But next step is, as before, with the moves, armies, artilleries and tanks. We don't have any tanks, so we will move armies if we need to. And quite honestly, I don't think I do, with the exception, possibly, of moving the French army there. Other than that, I think we're all good to go. The East Africa track you cannot move. I think I mentioned that in the German turn. You cannot move unless you are advancing or retreating following a combat. Cool, so movement's done. Fleets, I want to leave the fleets where they are, meaning we move to combat. The naval combat is first, again as it is with the German side. Nothing to fight here. The Germans have retreated from that box, meaning we don't worry about navy combat. Amphibious invasion would be the next step. Now, amphibious invasion is when you send a British unit from an area with a port to an enemy-controlled area with a port and do an invasion. Most of the areas with ports are Allied controlled, with the exception of Gallipoli. Sorry, Triple Entente Allies controlled, with the exception of Gallipoli, which is controlled by Turkey. Now, the other place you may do this is in Belgium, but there are restrictions. And this is where you basically have a combat in a port area with certain restrictions as what you can and can't do, and restrictions to advances and stuff. Not something that's applicable here. And to be honest, the only two places that'll ever really happen are Gallipoli and in Belgium. And like I said, there are restrictions in Belgium, but we can come to that if we need to later. So don't worry about amphibious invasions or beachheads at the moment, because they are really two halves of the same thing. So straight up then into ground combat. And I'll start in British East Africa. We can do this the same as normal. So I'll roll the dice, and this time I don't need to take the track, the counters off the track, because there are only ever these two counters on this track. So I'll roll the first dice for the British. I rolled a 6, and a second dice, which is for Germany, which is a 1. The Germans are beaten. They will flip to spent. Okay. The aim of this track, really, for a while it perplexed me, is why this would be here. Really, it's all about controlling production and how you can limit production spending through damaging the British East Africa army and eventually controlling the British East Africa supply area. So the Germans have to try and limit British supply as much as possible, really, and the British want to try to stop that. In terms of this track, now that it's spent, that army can never be unspent, can never be made fresh except through a card, which is slightly different to the refit rules shown elsewhere. Okay, now we've done that, we can move on to the next area. We cannot attack into or out of the Somme because they're all spent. So what we'll do is we will attack from the Rhine, into the Rhine from Verdun. Now this is 4 counters for the French, and we have 2 counters for the Germans, plus a trench, plus a superiority. And again, I said it at the end of the German turn. Not 100% sure if I did that correctly before, but you know, if I'm not entirely certain, just put it in the comments if I've got that wrong. But it will hopefully show what that air superiority does in this video rather than waiting for a later video. But we'll see. So, okay. Difference with this combat, though, is the presence of a trench. And trenches have to be fought first. And there's a kind of a ranking order, really. First thing you do is you attack the German trench, then you would do the German fresh units, then the German spent units. So we'll see what happens. So anyway, France against Germany, attacking the trench first. So we've got a 2 with a -2 because of that DRM, and then the DRM from the special rule. So that goes down to 0, but I don't think it can go any lower than 1. So let's roll a dice for that German trench, and we roll a 5. That unit is spent, unsurprisingly. But that card is no longer applicable, and the mandatory attack is also no longer applicable. But I'm going to do it one more time just to see if I can show you what happens with trenches. I've got a 2 for the French again, and a 6. So we're rinsing through our French units at this point. And I think I'll do one more in the hope that I can show you what happens with that German trench. And then I'll stop. So we've got a 2, and what are the odds of that happening? There's been no big push marker because we've had failures all round. So anything less than a 1, there you go. So that is the benefit of trenches. You have to get past them first, and if the dice are against you, then that's a problem. But what would happen, and just for demonstration, if let's pretend we're attacking with this one, we beat the trench, and therefore we breach it. This guy stays fresh, and then you can move down and attack the next unit as normal. But because you've breached the trench rather than attacking a unit, you do not get that additional marker for the big push. So that's what you'd have to do. Had we rolled doubles at any point, the air superiority counter could have been flipped over to its flown side to highlight the fact that the defender has won. But that's not applicable. The trench wasn't breached, and the French army has decided, quite sensibly perhaps, to stop while it's ahead. But even if we had breached that trench, because we had not successfully forced a retreat, the trench would have flipped back to its unbreached side anyway at the end of that combat. So let's pause there in terms of our combat into the Rhine. And we have a whole bunch of French units there that are in need of a refit already. Okay, other combat then for the Western Allies, there isn't any, because there's really very few units on the board. One thing I did forget to do in the British East Africa area, I do need to flip that because they attacked that still applies for the British unit in that track. Okay, so we're jumping straight into the production. So again, we check the blockade box, British controlled, no effect. Oh, I forgot, this is important. Combat phase. I can remove the squadron, East Asia squadron, by spending a British fleet and rolling a D3 plus. So let's do that. Spent that fleet, and we'll roll, see if we can remove that. And we have, meaning the East Asia squadron is removed from the game. Now, might not seem like much, but I've then got to spend production to get that guy back, which is quite frustrating. Okay, so properly balancing the production phase now. We've done the event U-boat attacks. Now this is a similar principle to the U-boat attrition in the German turn, only applies to the Western Allies. You roll 2 dice for each fresh U-boat and apply the result from a table. So here we have a result of 2, which is a success if the Western Allies U2 technology card is not active. Now we don't have it active, so that's a success, meaning we have 1 less production point for Britain as a result of that attack. And then we roll again for the second fresh U-boat, and it's a 5, and here we have a success if the convoys are not active, which they're not, so we have a -2 production for the British in this turn, which is quite frustrating. So next up then we go to refitting units. Currently there are only 2 Western Allies, the French and the British. The French would normally have 4 production points at the beginning, and the British would normally have 7, but there is a negative modifier to that 7. When you have multiple factions with differing amounts of production, you do the least production nation first. So Italy will go before France, which will go before Britain, essentially. Okay, so the French though have 4, and we will refit all 4 of those, like so. Okay, next up we will consider what we can do in the Somme. Now, I have done this slightly out of order. The Belgium counter there is a conquered army. Belgium was conquered by the French. Now, conquered armies and conquered nations I haven't really touched on yet because it gets a bit complicated. But basically, you will remove all bar 1, in most cases, you'll remove all bar 1 unit from the board, and that unit will be spent and will remain spent the rest of the game, unable to do anything except being amalgamated into another army. And this is what we're going to do in this case. So the Belgian army is going to be removed from the game to flip the French counter for free. If we come across a conquered nation in a later video, I will highlight what happens in more detail there. And there are certain special rules for some of the countries when that happens as well, but not so much for the Belgians. So now it's the British. Now the British start with baseline 7 production. So -2 for the U-boat attacks. So that's 5 total. So we have 1, 2, 3. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to what do I want to do? That's an excellent question. I want to provide support in the first instance for the French. So I'm going to use 2 production points as a transfer to France. Now, can I transfer to Russia and Serbia and places like that? The answer is yes, but only if there's land supply. I think that's correct. And there currently is no land supply because of the German areas here. Also, Greece is neutral, so we can't do it that way. Okay, so we have now got to research technology. Okay, and we've got C1, which is a counter battery. If I come a bit closer, what this does is it allows the Western Allies and Russia to place 1 heavy artillery unit in any land supplied area containing 1 army from that nation. And then it allows that the artillery to both attack and defend, which is awesome, especially so early in the game. So we'll get that, and we will take a heavy artillery from both the Russians and the Western Allies. I'll place the artillery into the Somme, and both France and Britain can use that. And here in probably Lithuania, no, Brest-Litovsk, let's do that. We'll place it there in Brest-Litovsk. And normally artillery add an attacking buff, which I'll come on to in a minute, but in the case of the C1 batteries or the counter batteries, they can actually defend with that same buff, which is kind of cool. So we'll come on to that in a moment. But next up then, we do air superiority. Now we don't have any air, so we don't really roll this. So we can't place any air superiority at this point, is my understanding. Bizarrely enough, air superiority is the one thing that really fails to sink into my mind with this game, but it makes a bit more sense to me as we get air technology on both sides, but certainly at this point, this is the one thing that doesn't sink in quite so well as you'd hope. But anyway, it is now the end of the Western Allies' turn, meaning we move on to the Eastern Allies. And I'll just go straight through. There is less to do with the Eastern Allies and the Central Allies. Much of what we've just done doesn't actually apply that much. So, but first thing we will still draw an event card. And the event card we've drawn is the Russian Steamroller. And what that means is during the Eastern Allies production phase, we place a spent Russian army in Petrograd and Moscow with no cost. That's awesome. 3 units, always good. Next up, we move armies, artillery and tanks. And I will move the Estonia army down. And I will move the Ukraine army here. It's still a limit of 2. As we progress through the game, that limit of 2 will change slightly in some circumstances, but for now it's still 2. There are no fleets or anything like that, or submarines or anything to worry about like that for the Russians, so we just ignore that step. Moving straight into combat. There is no navy combat, no amphibious invasion, no guerrilla combat, nothing like that for the supporting factions, so we go straight into ground combat. And the ground combat I'm going to do is from Brest-Litovsk into Prussia. And I'll do this off the map as before. So Prussia is the location. We have 1 German army, 3 Russian armies, and Russian artillery. And we may as well do an instant sort of demonstration of what happens with artillery. They can, when attached with a regular army, roll 2 dice instead of 1 in combat. So we're getting these DRMs coming in and these modifiers to combat already. So we'll roll. So essentially, it's this Russian army being modified by the artillery counter. So we roll 2 dice. We rolled a 1 and a 2, which is about as poor as we can get. But the 2 dice allows us to pick the highest, which I've done. That counter's spent. The Germans in defence have rolled a 6, so they're okay. So they're not spent. That army's spent. Now we need to do the next combat, which is again a straightforward Russia versus German army. And we've got a 1 for the Russians and a 1 for the Germans. So in this instance, the attackers do win. So both units are spent. Now I'm going to pause there and not attack any further from that location. Probably worth highlighting. Yeah, I'm going to attack. I'm going to pause attacking from that location because I want to keep an army fresh, just in case we have to do anything here or even attack somewhere else. But let's move the units back into Brest-Litovsk. Now the reason I've paused is because I have a couple of extra units up in Lithuania, which I now want to attack into Prussia. There is no big push modifier because we're attacking from a different area. So even though we're still attacking Prussia, we're doing it from Lithuania, not Brest-Litovsk. So Russian army against the spent German army is a 3 for the Russians versus a 1 for the Germans. So they have to retreat from Prussia into Posen. the Russian army is spent and must move in, and the Russian army that was in the same area in Lithuania can actually move forward as well and remain fresh, with the option of attacking later, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to attack later. Now that should actually be spent, shouldn't it? Okay, so now the options I have here now is to carry on that attack and hope to push into Posen, which has got some significant production elements, or hold off for now. I've got Russia, or Prussia, which is a -1 to the German production. I could carry on the attack in the hope of getting Hanover, but one thing I know in advance now, I've played this a few times, Russian production is not enough to cover Russian forces. So I'm going to pause there for now. And in fact, I'm going to pause the whole thing. I'm not going to attack anymore with Russia. Do have Serbia though. Well, Serbia can do something similar. And I think what we'll do with Serbia is we will attack up into Hungary. And also worth noting with the Germans, there was the Prussia area did have production, which means they could have done that "they shall not pass" rule where I can remove the German army, but I don't really want to do that at this stage because the Germans have tons of production and good opportunity to, take that back in time. Okay, so let's do Serbia against Hungary, starting with Serbians. They've rolled a 3 and Hungary has rolled a 2, so we are spent as Hungary, and one of those units is spent, and then we will also attack with the second Serbian unit into Hungary. Rolled a 2. We would have a big push marker, which would mean we would have a 3, and that's a 3, so they are moving in, retreating, and doing that down. Now again, I've not chosen to do the "they shall not pass" rule deliberately, because well, we'll see in a minute how we go on with attacking Serbia as the Eastern Allies. But that is the end of the turn. There's nothing else really to do except go back into the production phase. Most of the production we don't need to worry about unless there's any event cards, which there is just here, meaning the Russians get put 2 units on their spent sides, one in Petrograd, one in Moscow. That card's done. There's no received production for the Eastern Allies at this stage, so we can move on to the refit step, or the production spending step, which is to refit units. Now, Serbia don't have any resources, so they can't actually refit anybody unless they get a loan from Russia or somewhere. But at the moment, there's no real land supply to them, so they can't. They're kind of stuck. Okay, so refitting though. Well, we've got 5. I think it's 5. No, 4 in the first instance for Russia, although that can change. So we have 1 refit there, 2, 3, and then 4. When it comes to refitting units, you have to be in supply through the land areas, which everybody is at the moment. If ever it happens where they're not, I will highlight it when the time comes. Next up, then, we simply move to the next phase. Before we do that, we do get to refit any heavy artillery for free. That's the last thing that we do in the turn. So that's the end of the Eastern Allies turn. And next up then is the Central Allies. Same thing, draw an event card. Here we have something called the Skoda Works, which it says here, well, there's 2 circumstances, one with the artillery tech active and one with the artillery tech not active. We do not have the tech active in this case, so the Austro-Hungarian army gets to place a heavy artillery in any area with a unit. Not place it here in Bosnia. and that unit has an automatic dice roll of 6 this turn. Now, we are going to perform movement for the Austro-Hungarians, and I think I want to move 1 down, like so. And that's all the movement I'm going to do. Moving straight into attack then, this area here, with an automatic roll of 6 for the artillery, meaning we don't need to do a die roll for the Austro-Hungarians, we just do the defensive roll, which is a 6, but they get a +1 for the fact that the Serbians are defending in the mountains. So that means actually the Serbians won that combat. And now we move on to the next combat, which is this regular army into Serbia again. That's 2 for the Austro-Hungarians versus a 1 +1. It is a success for the attackers, just so the attackers will have to move in. Now, we've conquered Serbia as the Austro-Hungarians, and what that means is, as I sort of tried to explain with Belgium, the armies have to be removed. So that army is removed, and this army has to retreat. Now, we cannot retreat as the Austro-Hungarian, the retreating Serbian forces into Greece because it's neutral. Actually, let me just double check the special rules. Okay, so my understanding of the retreat rule in this circumstance is that we, as Serbia, have to retreat into a neutral nation. Albania can only be retreated into if there's absolutely no other option. Greece is a similar situation. There are certain special rules around that, and it's tricky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to retreat the Serbian army into Romania. Now, I'm not 100% sure that is the best thing to do or even the correct thing to do. Do shout into the comments if that is the case. But my understanding, at least, is the special rules governing Albania definitely, and to a lesser extent Greece, means that you cannot retreat into them as such. Romania will eventually become friendly, so I'm going to take it that that is the least worst option in terms of the rules there. Anywho's, the battle was won by Austro-Hungary. The Serbian army was reduced down to a single unit, which is spent, and it will remain spent for the whole of the rest of the game. The only thing it can now do is, if there is another unit from the same side in the same location, it can refit a unit for free. The previously controlled area in Hungary remains triple and controlled until another army moves in for the Austro-Hungarian side, which I'll show you how that works in a minute. And so anyway, that combat's finished, nothing else we can do around here. The artillery does not advance with the unit. There's only really, I think it's eventually tanks can and the Sostropan unit, but other than that, artillery stays where it is. But we now attack again with the Austro-Hungarians, and what I'll do is I'll show you how attacking into a previously friendly area but now enemy controlled works. And in the case of an area here where we have a triple entente controlled area that used to belong to us, a unit simply moves in and flips as part of the combat, regaining control of that production area, which is what I was hoping would happen and why I didn't do the whole they shall not pass thing earlier on with that unit. Next, I will show you how it works when you attack an area that is not friendly, but is not containing a unit, which is what's called garrison. So here we'll attack into Poland from Galicia. What we'll do is we'll roll a dice for the attackers, and depending on the terrain, it's a certain die roll we have to beat. So for an area with no terrain modifiers, no mountains, no production, no home area, it's a 2+. Any mountains, production, home area, it is then a 3+. So here it's just a 2, so we need to beat 2 in order to equal to or beat 2 in order to move into Poland. And I've got a 6, so that army will move into Poland, like so. And I will leave that unit there for now, just in case. Okay, last thing we need to do then is think about production. We have a single production point. We don't worry about any events at this point. There's no blockade box to check, no U-boats to worry about, so we just take that, and Austria's baseline production of 3 is now pushed to 4. And so the 4 units are one refit that one, and then that one. The artillery refits automatically as the very last thing on the turn. And that's it. Next up, we move into 1914 winter turn. The introduction of Turkey and the Middle Eastern region will happen in this turn. So I'll see you back for that video then. I will move through the videos a bit quicker from this point on, because hopefully the basics of the game have been covered in this one, and I'll spend more time on those areas where there is something new in later videos, but mostly I'll just play the game. Anyway, hope this has been helpful, hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you for the next one, which is Winter 1914.